Welcome. I'm Zan-Misélel Κουστώ, and this is Stories of the Sea. Until the 1940s, the remote islands of the Pacific had remained untouched by economic growth of the Western world. Their inhabitants lived an idyllic life in a land described by many as paradise. The outbreak of World War II in the Pacific had an overwhelming impact on these islands. Some were destroyed in battle, others changed with the construction of modern ports, airstrips, and the influx of thousands of troops. Despite the shock of war and modernization, the joyful spirit of the island people has survived. As we enter the 20th century, come with us as we visit these islands and remember a time before jet travel and tourism.
From the Philippines in the west, the continent of Australia in the south, to the Hawaiian Islands in the east, the Pacific is littered with hundreds of remote islands. Isolated from the rest of the world, these innocent people lived a life of serenity and beauty. Thousands of years since the original settlers first came to the Pacific, the people of the islands developed their own unique culture, far from the influence of the outside world. All this changed dramatically at the onset of World War II. The peace in the Pacific Ocean was shattered when Japanese bombers raided the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. For months, the Japanese marched across the Pacific, winning victory after victory. They routed the Americans in the Philippines, the Dutch in the East Indies, and the British in Burma, Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. After only 8 months of war, the Japanese occupied and controlled 20 million square miles of territory, 5 times more than the Germans in Nazi Europe. In the next few years, many of the islands in the Pacific moved from obscurity to legend. Isolated on their remote islands, for many natives, the first time they ever saw a wheel was on the trucks and aircraft of the invading Japanese. Forced into the center of a war they knew little about, the islanders were caught up in the fight. In January 1942, the Japanese seized New Britain and the port of Rabaul. Soon after, their seaborne troops landed on New Guinea's northeast shore and threatened Australia. The Australian Navy had set up a unique intelligence network along their coastline. The Coast Watchers, as they were called, were assigned to report suspicious sighting of ships or planes. They noted in 1939, Japan was displaying a keen interest in their northern coast area. As a precaution, the Australians expanded their network to include the islands north and east of their shores. Several hundred local civil servants, plantation owners, and missionaries were enlisted into the Coast Watchers network. After the outbreak of war, they in turn recruited many of the local islanders. Together, they moved into the hills, and hidden from the Japanese invaders, they quickly became the Allies' eyes and ears in the islands. The native scouts kept a detailed record on every defensive position the Japanese built. Then they transmitted the coded information to the Allies. The Japanese knew what the coast watchers and the islander scouts were up to. They sent troops with bloodhounds to hunt them down. But the islanders weren't easily traced. They knew primitive survival tactics and ate taro roots to keep from starving while in hiding. They were frightened, but in their determination to help in the fight for freedom, they never stopped sending in reports. In the spring of 1942, the Coast Watchers reported that the Japanese had descended on an obscure island in the South Pacific known as Guadalcanal. The Japanese began building an airfield on the island's north coast. Their goal was clear. If their bombers could strike the islands of the New Hebrides, Fiji, and Samoa, the main shipping route between the United States and Australia would fall into their control. On August 7, 1942, the Allied offensive in the Pacific began with an assault on Guadalcanal. Caught by surprise, the Japanese construction crew fled into the hills. The Marines landed unopposed. But in the next 6 months, this small island in the Solomon chain became known as the Island of Death. Tens of thousands of men would die as the Japanese and Americans fought for control of Guadalcanal. From their hideout in the hills, the natives watched the Allied Marines swarm onto the beach. Wearing only loincloths and rifles on their shoulders, the islanders marched down to meet them. The islanders were amazed by the modern equipment the Marines carried ashore. Overnight, the war had literally changed their lives. The islanders began helping the Marines unload supplies. Many others risked their lives serving the Allies as scouts, guides, porters, and spies. Jacob Buza was one such scout. Captured during a mission on Guadalcanal, the Japanese quickly discovered that he was carrying a small American flag given to him by a Marine. After refusing to answer their questions, he was tied to a tree and beaten with rifle bullets. His captors bayoneted him 5 times, slashed his throat, and left him for dead. Still alive, Jacob chewed through his bonds and dragged himself to a Marine position 3 miles away. Before he collapsed from loss of blood, he delivered vital information on the enemy's strength on the island. The Coast Watchers saved Guadalcanal, said Admiral William Halsey. For his extraordinary bravery, Jacob Buza was awarded the U.S. Silver Star. The islanders worked with the Allies in the critical task of finishing the airstrip. Controlling the island would continue for another 6 months before the Japanese were finally defeated. After only a few months of war, this island of quiet villages and peaceful people had become almost unrecognizable. For better or worse, the Second World War brought the islanders into the modern world. The Caroline Islands lie 1,300 miles southeast of Tokyo. They were a key link in the Japanese defensive chain. By taking them, the Allies would cut the enemy supply line and isolate their stronghold on the island of Truk. Truk was a powerful Japanese air and naval base. The island's deep water lagoon was a major anchorage for Japanese ships. After the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, American forces in the Pacific waited for the day they could retaliate. On the morning of February 17, 1944, there were almost 60 Japanese ships anchored in Truk's 40-mile-wide lagoon. American aircraft carriers sent 4 Japanese planes to attack. In the first hours of fighting, many Japanese fighter planes who tried to intercept the Americans were shot down in the lagoon. When the battle was over, more than 50 Japanese ships and many more aircraft lay in the lagoon's bottom. more than 50 years later, as if frozen in time, these ghost ships are still locked in time. Today, Truck Lagoon is preserved as a memorial to the thousands who died here. Each year, divers from around the world explore this huge underwater war museum. On the ocean floor lies the Fujikawa Maru, an immense armed cargo ship used by the Japanese to transport airplanes. In her hold, divers can find Japanese Zeros scattered about. Stacks of propeller blades and spare parts are piled nearby. The Nippon Maru, loaded with artillery, trucks, mines, and tons of ammunition, is another cargo ship that went down. A tank sits in an odd position on her tilted deck. Deep in her cargo hold, divers can still find the skeletal remains of Japanese sailors who were trapped at their positions when the ship went down. Fine china dishes and cut crystal remain in what was once the officers' dining area. On the bridge, the ship's telegraph. The system that enables a captain to signal speed changes to the engine room is still intact. A large Japanese bomber lies with the propellers and engine cowling dug into the sand. In her cockpit, divers can still read the plane's intact instrument board. It is ironic that the destruction of war has created a local dive industry for the islanders. For as long as these machines of war remain, divers will continue to visit their beautiful island and swim among the iron relics of war. Thousands of miles away from Truk, French Polynesia is considered one of the most beautiful places on Earth. While these islands were not directly involved in battle during World War II, they were still deeply affected. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in the Philippines, Bora Bora was selected by the United States as a fuel and staging base. Bora Bora's deep water lagoon was perfect for assembling supply convoys. 6,000 servicemen were stationed on the island, and the territory's first airstrip was constructed. Several coastal defense guns were placed on the island's foothills. Now rusted, the guns still point towards the sea, a monument to an attack that never came. Not all the islands in the region were so lucky. Many were the scene of some of the heaviest combat of the war. Where the international dateline crosses the equator, the Gilbert Islands are one of the most remote places in the world. In the vastness of the equatorial Pacific, a lonely, peaceful lagoon surrounded by a necklace of palm-shaded islands is all that is left of a once towering volcanic peak. These dots of coral with sandy beaches and palm trees are still home to a small number of native people, content with a life of sailing and fishing. It's hard to believe that this was the scene of some of the bloodiest fighting in the Pacific. 50 years ago, the island of Tarawa became known as Bloody Tarawa as the United States Marine Corps stormed ashore under heavy Japanese fire. 69-year-old islander Loto Honorio recalls the morning when this backwater British colony was awakened by the 20th century.
I remember that time when two Japanese warships came to Tarawa. They landed their troops on the island of Desio, and the natives then were so disturbed during their sleep, and they didn't know where to flee to. They didn't know where the trouble was. Only a shout among the natives, "The Japanese are here, have landed." And they just flew to all parts of Desio, not knowing where the real danger was. During that visit of theirs, they went ashore. They destroyed every possible floating craft they could lay a hand on. In including the small precious canoes of the locals.
The next year, the Japanese began turning tiny Tarawa's 291 acres into an impregnable fortress. Using the islanders as slave labor, they constructed tank traps, heavy machine gun emplacements, and a series of interconnected trenches and tunnels. The Japanese built block houses along strategic points, mounted heavy guns, big enough to sink a battleship. The Americans had to take the island and its airstrip to cut off the Japanese. For 7 days and nights, the Air Force and Navy blasted the island's fortifications. On the morning of November 20, 1943, the first amphibious wave of U.S. Marines approached the beach. They were shocked to discover that the tide was out, that the reef was exposed, hundreds of yards from shore. 42 Amtraks and amphibious tanks ground under the coral reef. Fortified Japanese troops opened up with devastating. The Marines, carrying 70-pound packs, waded to shore. Under murderous Japanese fire, hundreds were killed. Many of the wounded simply drowned in the sea. The Marines who reached the shore were pinned down behind a defensive seawall. They had already lost 70% of their unit. Above the beach, the Japanese manned over 500 pillboxes. The Marines had only one choice: to attack. Small groups infiltrated the Japanese trenches and tunnels. They flushed out the enemy using explosives and flamethrowers. By the end of the first day, the Marine advance could be measured in yards. Most of the Marines were still pinned on the beach. The commander of the Japanese forces, Admiral Kaiji Shibasaki, directed his troops from inside a massive two-story blockhouse. Late on the second day of fighting, the Navy brought in a destroyer with its 5-inch guns and opened fire on the blockhouse. The concrete bunker was blasted with over 80 rounds, but its 5-foot-thick walls could not be breached. Although still alive inside the fortress, the Japanese commander feared the end was near. The next morning, the Marines captured the roof of the blockhouse, but the Japanese refused to surrender. The Marines poured gasoline and explosives into the air shafts and destroyed the fortress. In the end, of the 5,000 Japanese troops who defended them, only 17 survived. The American flag was raised in victory, and it was very costly. More than 1,100 Americans had been killed. The Battle of Tarawa lasted little more than 72 hours. It took the island another 25 years to recover from the catastrophe of war. Today, the airstrip for which so many men died is once again. The rusted debris which litters the beach is evidence of the battle's heaviest fighting. A Sherman tank rests in the same position it stopped more than 50 years ago. It bears mute witness to the horrors. The Marines remember Tarawa as a bloody battleground. But after 50 years, the children and the grandchildren of the islanders see the litter of war as a playground. From Guam in the eastern Pacific, it takes a 4-hour plane ride to reach the island of Yap. During the war, Yap was under Japanese control. American ground troops never landed, but the airstrip was frequently bombed by the Air Force. Relics from the Pacific campaign litter the island. A B-17 bomber lies under years of jungle growth. The fuselage still carries a proud display of bombing runs. Yap is no stranger to invasion. It has known a succession of foreigners. The Spanish claimed the island first when they discovered it in the 18th century. The Germans purchased the territory from the Spanish in 1895. German control ended with the appearance of the Japanese government. It is known as the Island of Stone Money. Many villages display huge stone discs called rise. They were originally carved and transported to Yap from the Palau Islands, hundreds of miles away. Some of the stones measure as much as 16 feet across. It is quite a feat to move these stone discs using only dugout canoes. Today, the people of Yap survive by gardening and fishing. Their main crops include taro, yams, sweet potatoes, and bananas. They also earn extra money by selling for scrap the wreckage left by war. In the late 1940s, the American government tried to help the Pacific Islanders return to their traditions and life that they had known before the war began. But too many things have changed. The old sailing ships and flying boats that once worked between the islands were gone. Walking was once the main mode of transportation. Now cars crowd the streets of the towns. Each year, the international airports and chains of luxury hotels bring millions of vacationers to the islands. Tahiti was once written in books as one of the most beautiful, unspoiled of all the islands. Today, the capital of French Polynesia, Papeete, has become as cosmopolitan as Paris. The outdoor cafes on the Boulevard Pomale are filled with an amazing array of international travelers. Today, tourists can buy French perfumes, pearls, and even the latest fashions in the many shops on the island. The hotels pamper tourists with luxury. Visitors are surrounded by entertainment provided by colorful Tahitian dancers. Many of the traditional ceremonies performed still hold important meaning for the people of the islands. The hula dance and fireworking are part of the Polynesian culture, a way of life that has withstood many centuries. Although the younger generation of islanders try to maintain a strong respect for their past, they do not ignore the present. As their ancient traditions collide with Western culture, it is the young Tahitians who dance to a different beat. The people of the islands of the Pacific are aware of the changing world around them. They feel their ancient cultures clashing with modernization. Many people have moved from remote villages to the island's largest cities. Cut off from their cultural roots, far from their magic lagoons, many of them feel alien in this new, fast-paced world.
Even though the scars of the war have healed, there is another battle being fought in the Pacific Ocean. The islanders are drawn to the Western world's movies, cars, and music. Many wonder if they will be able to hold on to their traditions, or if the solution is to fuse their own culture with that of modern West. Despite the rapid changes to the islands, there still are places of great natural beauty. The people have retained their spirit of peace and joy. For many, the islands of the Pacific will always remain a paradise found. I'm Zan-Misélel Κουστώ, and this is Stories of the Sea.